Здравствуйте. Сегодняшний монолог за рулем не столько монолог, сколько аудиокнига. Называется она «Граф Монте-Кристо». Александр Дюма ее написал. Есть у нее название другое «Сокровища графа Монте-Кристо». Эта книга на английском языке. На мой взгляд, она очень интересная. Язык, которым начитана эта книга, легкий, воспринимается хорошо, легко. Начинающим это будет очень интересно и полезно. Конечно, потрясающе удобно это сначала прочитать книгу, а затем послушать аудиокнигу на английском языке, потому что вы начинаете узнавать те имена, фамилии, которые были в книге, и воспринимается это совсем по-другому. Ну, мы сегодня двигаемся из города Старый Оскол. Наш маршрут лежит на Украину, в город Комсомольск на Днепре. И попутно мы слушаем аудиокнигу. Спасибо. Приятного вам времени.
Treasure of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, retold by John Escott. Chapter 1. The Pharaon Comes Home. On the 24th of February 1815, the ship Pharaon arrived at the port of Marseille. A large crowd was standing on the quay. The people had come down to the harbour to greet the ship. It was always exciting when a ship arrived in Marseille, and this ship had been built in the city, and the ship's owner lived there. The owner of the Pharaon was Monsieur Morel. He did not wait for his ship to reach the harbour. He immediately jumped into a longboat and rowed towards the Pharaon. A young man was standing on the deck of the Pharaon. When he saw Monsieur Morel, he went to the starboard side of the ship. The young man was the first officer of the Pharaon. He was tall, between 18 and 20 years old, and had thick black hair. His bright dark eyes were calm and intelligent. The young man turned round and gave an order to the crew. The sailors ran quickly to their places and waited. Some men stood on the decks. Other men climbed up the tall masts. "Edmond! Edmond Dantes!" shouted Morel from the longboat. "Where is the captain? What's happened to Captain Leclerc?" "Something very sad, sir," replied the first officer. "When we were near Civitavecchia, we lost our brave captain." "And what has happened to the cargo?" the ship owner asked. "It's all safe, sir. But poor Captain Leclerc." "What happened to him?" asked Morel. "Did he fall into the sea?" "No, sir. He suddenly became ill and died," said Dantes. "He died of brain fever. We buried him at sea." "Oh, poor Captain Leclerc. He was only 39 years old," said Morel. "But Edmond, we must all die one day. Did you say that the cargo is safe?" "Please, come aboard, sir," said Dantes. "Here is Danglars, the cargo master. You can ask him about our cargo. He'll also tell you more about the captain's death. I must give some orders to the crew." Dantes turned to the sailors on the deck. "Lower all the sails!" he shouted. Morel climbed up the side of the Pharaon and greeted Danglars. "You've heard our sad news, Monsieur Morel, said Danglars. The cargo master was 25 or 26 years old, and he always had an angry expression on his face. The crew of the Pharaon did not like him. Yes, poor Captain Leclerc, said Morel. He was a brave and honest man. Yes, and he was an experienced man, not a boy, said Danglars. He knew a lot about ships and the sea. He was the kind of captain that you need, sir. But a sailor does not need to be old to understand his work, Danglars, said Morel. He watched Dantès give more orders to the crew. Look at Edmond. He knows his work well. Yes, said Danglars. He looked at Dantès, and his eyes were full of hate. Dantès is young and confident. He began to give orders to the crew before the captain had died. But he also made us lose a day and a half on the voyage. We stopped at the island of Elba. Edmond is the first officer, said Morel. A first officer has to sail a ship when a captain cannot do his work. But Edmond was wrong to lose time at Elba. Morel called to the young man. Edmond, come here. In a moment, sir, replied Dantès. He shouted to the men who were standing by the heavy chain which was attached to the anchor. Drop the anchor, he ordered. Immediately, the sailors let the heavy anchor drop into the sea, and the Pharaon stopped. Do you see? Said Danglars. Dantès is like a captain already. He works well, said Morel. He'll be captain soon. This news did not please Danglars. When Dantès came towards Morel, Danglars moved away. You wanted to speak to me, sir? Said Dantès. Yes, said Morel. Why did you stop the ship at Elba? Captain Leclerc ordered me to go there, said Dantès. Before he died, he gave me a packet. He told me to take it to Marshal Bertrand on the island. Morel moved closer to Dantès and spoke quietly. And did you see Marshal Bertrand? He asked. Did you see Napoleon's advisor? Yes, sir. And did you speak to the Emperor? Asked Morel. He spoke to me, said Dantès, smiling. Emperor Napoleon asked me questions about the Pharaon. I told him that the ship belonged to you, sir. Then Napoleon said, There was a soldier called Policar Morel in my army at Valence. That's true, said Morel happily. Policar Morel was my uncle. You were right to stop at Elba, Edmond. But don't tell anyone that you spoke with Napoleon. It could bring you trouble. Why? Said Dantès calmly. I didn't know what was in the packet. Napoleon only asked simple questions about the ship. He didn't talk about politics. Oh, excuse me, sir. The customs officers are coming aboard. And Dantès went to the side of the ship. Danglars came and stood beside Morel. Did Dantès tell you why he delayed the voyage? He asked. He was obeying the last order from Captain Leclerc, replied Morel. And did Dantès give you a letter from the captain? A letter, said Morel. A letter for me? The captain gave Dantès a letter, as well as the packet for Elba, said Danglars. How do you know about the packet? Asked Morel. I was going past the captain's cabin, Danglars said. The door was open, and I saw the captain give the packet and a letter to Dantès. He said nothing to me about a letter, said Morel. But if there is a letter, Edmond will give it to me. Perhaps I made a mistake. Please say nothing about it to Dantès, said Danglars. The cargo master walked away when Dantès returned to the ship owner. Edmond, will you come and have dinner with me this evening? Asked Morel. Excuse me, sir, but I must visit my father tonight, said the young man. Oh, yes, said Morel. I haven't seen your father for a few weeks, but I think that he's well. You're a good son, Edmond. Visit your father, then come and see me. Please excuse me again, said Dantes. There is another person that I must see. Of course, said Morel. You'll want to see Mercedes. She visited me 3 times to ask about news of the Pharaon. Edmond, you have a very beautiful lover. Mercedes isn't my lover. She is my fiancée, said Dantes. She's the woman that I'm going to marry. I wish you happiness and a long life, said Morel. But tell me, did Captain Leclerc give you a letter for me before he died? No, sir, said Dantes. Captain Leclerc couldn't write. Now, I must ask for some time away from my work. After my marriage, I have to go to Paris. Take all the time that you need, said Morel. The Pharaon will not sail for 3 or 4 months. He smiled and put a hand on Dantes' arm. And the ship can't sail again without the new captain. Do you mean that I shall be the captain of the Pharaon? Cried Dantes. Oh, thank you, Monsieur Morel. My father and Mercedes will be very pleased. That's good, Edmond. Take the longboat and go to your father. Visit Mercedes in Les Catalans, and then come to me. Shall I take you ashore, sir? Asked Dantes. No, I'll stay aboard and speak to Danglars about the cargo, said Morel. Were you happy with his work on this voyage? Danglars doesn't like me, said Dantes quietly. We had an argument near the island of Monte-Cristo, but I have nothing bad to say about his work. He's a good cargo master. You're a good man, Edmond, said Morel. Go now, and good luck to you. Morel watched the young man jump into the longboat. In a few minutes, Dantes had rowed to the quay. Morel turned away and saw Danglars standing a few meters away. The cargo master was staring at Dantes. He had an angry expression on his face. Chapter 2. Mercedes. Louis and Edmond Dantes lived in a small, simple house in one of the city's narrow streets. The old man gave a cry of joy when he saw his son. "My boy!" said Louis. The old man's face was pale, and his body began to shake. "What's wrong?" asked Edmond. "Are you ill?" "No, my dear son. I didn't know that the Pharaon had arrived in Marseille. This is a wonderful surprise. Tell me all the news of the voyage." "First, I have sad news, father," said Edmond. "Captain Leclerc is dead. I didn't want that to happen, of course, but now Monsieur Morel tells me that I'll be captain of the Pharaon, and I'll be paid well. Do you understand, father? I'm going to be a captain, and I'm not yet 20. "That is good news," said the old man in a weak voice, and he sat down in a chair. "There is something wrong," said Edmond. "You're ill." "I'm not ill," answered Louis. "I'm just a little tired." "You need a glass of wine," said Dantes. "Where do you keep the wine?" He began to look in the cupboards. "There is no wine," said the old man. "What? "Why is there no wine?" said Edmond. "Didn't I leave you enough money before the voyage? I gave you 200 francs before I left 3 months ago." "Yes," replied his father, "but I had to pay our debt to Caderousse." "But the debt to Caderousse was 140 francs, said Edmond. "Have you lived for 3 months on only 60 francs? He took all the money from his pockets and put it on the table. "Here, take this. I earned it on the voyage. Buy some food and drink immediately." Edmond heard footsteps outside the house. "Who's coming here now?" he said. "It's Caderousse," said the old man. "He'll be coming to give you his good wishes." "Then his lips will say one thing while his head thinks something else," Edmond said to himself. Caderousse came to the door. He was holding a piece of cloth in his hands. Caderousse was a tailor. His shop was beside the house where Louis and Edmond Dantes lived. "Edmond Dantes," said Caderousse, smiling and showing his white teeth. "You've returned." "Yes, Caderousse," said Edmond in a polite, cold voice. "Do you have a problem? Can I help you?" Caderousse smiled again. "Thank you," he said. "I don't want any help. But sometimes there are others who need me. Not you, sirs. I gave you money, but you've paid me." Caderousse walked round the room. "I met my friend Danglars in the city," he said. "He told me that you were in Marseille again, Edmond." The tailor's eyes shone brightly when he saw the money on the table. "And you're now a rich man," he said. "This money isn't mine, it's my father's," said Edmond. "Danglars told me that you're going to be the new captain of the Pharaon," said Caderousse. "All your friends will be happy when they hear about your good luck. And I know one young lady who will be pleased. Yes, Mercedes," said Louis. "Edmond, go and see your fiancée." "You were right to come home quickly," said Caderousse unpleasantly. "Mercedes is a fine girl, and fine girls have many admirers. Go and see her, and give her your good news." "I will," said Edmond, and he left the house. Caderousse talked to the old man for a minute or two, then he left. He walked to the corner of the Rue Senac, where Danglars was waiting for him. "Did you see young Dantes?" asked Danglars. "I did," said Caderousse, smiling. "He believes that he will be captain of the Pharaon." "Dantes is not captain yet," said Danglars. "Is he going to marry the beautiful Mercedes?" "Yes," said Caderousse, "but he could have trouble there. Mercedes has a handsome young admirer. He's a 21-year-old Catalan, and he's her cousin." Danglars looked pleased about this. "Let's go to La Réserve and have a drink while we wait for news," he said. 100 meters from La Réserve Café was Les Catalans. Mercedes lived in a small white house in this village. She was a beautiful girl, with shining black hair, large dark eyes, and a pretty figure. She was 17 years old. Mercedes was talking to a tall young man. He was her cousin, Fernand. "Mercedes," said Fernand, "please tell me that you will marry me." He looked at Mercedes with love in his eyes. "I've answered you 100 times, Fernand," said Mercedes. "You must be very stupid to ask me again." "Don't you want me to be happy?" said Fernand. "For 10 years I've dreamt that you'll be my wife. I love you, Mercedes." "Fernand, I've never done anything to make you love me," the girl replied. "And I don't want to marry you." I love you like a brother, that is all." "You believe that Dantes will return," said Fernand. "That is why you are saying this. But perhaps he doesn't love you now, or perhaps he's dead." "Fernand!" cried Mercedes. "I love Edmond." "And will you always love him, and not me?" Fernand asked, holding Mercedes' hand. "I'll love him for as long as I live," said Mercedes. "But if he's dead?" "Then I shall die too." "But perhaps he's forgotten you and—" "Mercedes!" called a voice from outside the house. "Oh!" cried the young girl. Her eyes shone with happiness. "He's here! He hasn't forgotten me!" And she ran to open the door. "Edmond, I'm here!" she said. In a moment, Dantes and Mercedes had their arms around each other. At first the lovers saw nothing around them, but then Dantes saw Fernand. "Oh," he said, "I didn't know that anyone else was here." "This is my cousin Fernand," said Mercedes. "He's my friend, and he'll be your friend too, Edmond." "Hello, Fernand," said Dantes, and he politely held out his hand. But Fernand did not shake Edmond's hand. In fact, he did not move. He had an expression of hate on his face. "I didn't expect to meet an enemy here," said Dantes after a moment. "An enemy?" said Mercedes. "There's no enemy here. There's only Fernand, who will shake your hand and greet you like a friend." The young woman looked angrily at her cousin. As soon as he had shaken Dantes' hand, Fernand turned and left the house. "Hello, Fernand," called a voice. "Where are you going?" The speaker was the tailor, Caderousse. He was sitting outside La Réserve with Danglars. The two men had been drinking wine for several hours. Caderousse was now very drunk. Fernand looked at them for a few seconds. Then he came to their table and sat with them. "You look like a disappointed lover, Fernand," said Caderousse, laughing loudly. He gave the young man a glass of wine. Then he filled his own glass for the 8th or 9th time. "You didn't think that Dantes was going to return to Marseille so suddenly, did you?" said Danglars. "Perhaps you thought that he was dead. Or perhaps you thought that he had found another lover. When is Dantes going to marry the beautiful Mercedes?" "They haven't chosen a date yet," said Fernand. "No, but their wedding will be soon," said Caderousse. "Let's drink to the marriage of Captain Edmond Dantes and the beautiful Mercedes." As he lifted his glass, he spilled wine on his clothes. Fernand threw his glass of wine onto the ground, and Caderousse laughed loudly. Then he saw two young people walking towards the cafe. "Ah, look, Fernand," he said. "Two lovers are coming this way. See how they kiss each other's lips and look into each other's eyes? It's Edmond and Mercedes." Fernand's face had become red, and he looked down at the table. "Hello, Dantes," called Caderousse. He lifted his wine glass again. "Are you too proud to speak to your friends?" "No, sir," replied Dantes. "When is your wedding day?" asked Danglars. "Tomorrow or the next day," said Dantes. "We'll have the wedding feast here in La Réserve. Please come and celebrate with us. There will be good food and wine. After the feast, Mercedes and I will go to the priest and he'll marry us." "You are marrying quickly, Captain," said Danglars. Dantes smiled. "I'm not a captain yet," he said. "But you are marrying quickly," said Danglars. "I want to get married soon, Because I must go to Paris after the wedding, Dantes replied. Paris? Said Danglars. Do you have business there? Captain Leclerc asked me to do something for him, said Dantes, and he and Mercedes began to walk away. I suspect that he's going to deliver Bertrand's letter, said Danglars to himself. And that gives me an idea. Chapter 3. The Letter. Danglars watched Dantes and Mercedes walk away. Then he turned to the young Catalan. Fernand, do you love Mercedes? He asked. Yes, said Fernand. I love her more than Dantes loves her. I want to kill Dantes. But if he dies, Mercedes will kill herself. She told me this. Perhaps you can stop the wedding. Then Dantes would not have to die, said Danglars. He called to a waiter. Bring me a pen and some paper. A few minutes later, the waiter brought a pen, a pot of ink, and some pieces of paper to the table. Dantes stopped at the island of Elba during our voyage, Danglars told Fernand. Perhaps he met Bonaparte there. If someone told the prosecutor of Marseille that Dantes was a special agent for the Bonapartists, Dantes would be arrested. I'll tell the prosecutor, cried Fernand. No, you mustn't do that, said Danglars. Dantes would suspect that you told the prosecutor about his visit to Elba. No, a letter will be perfect. The cargo master smiled and began to write a letter. Danglars usually wrote with his right hand, but now he slowly wrote the letter with his left hand. He was disguising his handwriting. This letter is from a friend of the king. Edmond Dantes, first officer of the ship Pharaon, is going to deliver a letter to friends of Napoleon in Paris. You will find proof of this crime when you arrest him, or you will find proof at his father's house. When he had finished writing, Danglars addressed the letter to the prosecutor of Marseille. Caderousse had been sleeping for a few minutes. Now he suddenly lifted his head and opened his eyes. He saw the letter that Danglars had written. "No!" Caderousse cried. "Dantes is my friend!" The drunken tailor tried to take the letter from Danglars, but he moved too quickly and nearly fell off his chair. Danglars threw the letter onto the floor in the corner of the cafe. "Don't worry about the letter, my friend," he said to Caderousse. "It was just a bad joke. You've had too much wine. I'll take you home. Fernand, will you come with us?" "No," said Fernand. "I'm going home." When Danglars and Caderousse were 20 meters from the cafe, Danglars looked back. He smiled. He saw Fernand pick up the letter and walk away quickly. Many guests came to Dantes and Mercedes' wedding feast. Some of them were men from the Pharaon. When Morel came into the cafe, he told the sailors that Dantes was going to be their new captain. They were pleased. Mercedes and Edmond were standing with Louis Dantes and Fernand. Danglars and Caderousse went to talk to them. Caderousse told Edmond that Morel had arrived at the feast. "This is the happiest day of my life," Edmond said, smiling. He looked at Mercedes with love in his eyes. It's 1:15. At 2:30, my dear Mercedes will become Madame Dantes. The guests feasted on the good food and fine wine. They wished good luck to Dantes and Mercedes. Soon it was time for the young people to meet the priest. "Come with us, everyone!" cried Dantes. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door. "Open, in the name of the law!" called a voice. No one spoke, and no one moved. The door opened, and an officer of police and 5 soldiers walked in. The soldiers were all carrying guns. "Why are you here, sir?" Morel asked the police officer. The man did not reply. "Which of you is Edmond Dantes?" he asked. "I am," said Edmond. "What do you want?" "Edmond Dantes, I'm here to arrest you," said the officer. Mercedes cried out and began to weep. "This must be a mistake," said Morel. "What crime am I accused of?" asked Dantes. "You'll be told later," said the officer. Caderousse whispered to Danglars, "What does this mean?" "I don't know," replied Danglars. Caderousse looked for Fernand, but he could not see him in the cafe. "This is about that letter," he said to Danglars. "Don't be stupid," said the cargo master. "But," began Caderousse. "Be quiet, you fool," said Danglars. "You drank too much wine yesterday. You know nothing about it." Dantes was saying goodbye to his friends. "Don't worry," he said. "This is a mistake. I'll return very soon." Dantes went down the stairs with the police officer and the soldiers. A carriage was waiting outside La Réserve, and he was pushed into it. Mercedes ran down the stairs to the street. She looked through the window of the carriage. "Goodbye, my dearest Edmond," she cried. "Goodbye, Mercedes," called Dantes. "We'll soon meet again." Then the horses jumped forward and pulled the carriage down the street. In a few minutes, the carriage had gone around the corner and disappeared. "Wait for me here, all of you," said Morel. "I'll follow Dantes. The officer will take him to the prosecutor's office, I am sure. I'll go there. I'll bring you news as soon as I can." At that moment, Fernand came into the room and sat down. His face was very pale. He had a glass of water in his hand. His hand shook as he drank from the glass. "This is all Fernand's work, I'm sure," Caderousse said to Danglars quietly. "No, he couldn't have done this," said Danglars. "He's too stupid." Time passed slowly, but at last Morel returned to the cafe. He had a worried expression on his face. Mercedes, Louis, and all the guests came and stood round him. "Dantes is in serious trouble," said Morel. "He is accused of treason. Prosecutor Villefort said, 'Dantes is a traitor to the king. He is a Bonapartist agent.'" Mercedes cried out, and Louis Dantes sat down on a chair. Caderousse moved closer to Danglars. "You lied to me," he whispered. "The letter that you wrote yesterday reached the prosecutor of Marseille. But I can't let an old man and an innocent girl die of unhappiness. I'll tell the prosecutor that Dantes is not guilty." "Silent, you fool," said Danglars. He held Caderousse's arm. "Perhaps Dantes isn't innocent. Who can be sure? The Pharaon did stop at Elba, and Dantes did go ashore. Perhaps he has Bonapartist letters or papers with him. prosecutor will find them. But there is danger for us. Any friend of Dantes, or anyone who works with him, will be suspected of treason too. Caderousse thought for a moment. We'll wait and see if Dantes is guilty or innocent, he said. The guests began to leave the cafe. Louis Dantes' friends took him back to his house, and Fernande took Mercedes to her home. Very soon, everyone in Marseille had heard the news of Edmond's arrest. Later that day, Morel saw Danglars and Caderousse. "Can you believe that this has happened, Danglars?" Morel said. "Dantes, arrested for treason." "I was suspicious when Dantes stopped the Pharaon at Elba," said Danglars. "Remember, I told you this when the ship returned on 24th February. Yes. Did you tell your suspicions to anyone else?" asked Morel. "No, I didn't," said the cargo master. "You're a good man, Danglars," said Morel. "And the Pharaon has no captain now." "The Pharaon cannot leave Marseille for 3 months," said Danglars. "We have to make some repairs to Pharaon. Then we have to load a cargo onto the ship. Let's hope that Dantes is a free man again after 3 months. Until then, I can take care of the ship for you." "Thank you, Danglars. I'll go and see Prosecutor Villefort again. I'll ask for news of Dantes. Go to the ship. I'll meet you there later." The ship owner walked away, and Danglars turned to Caderousse. "All goes well," he said to the tailor. "But your false letter to Villefort," began Caderousse. "Fernand must have sent the letter," said Danglars. "He's jealous of Dantes. He wants Mercedes for himself. He must have picked up the letter. Did he copy it onto another piece of paper? Or did he send my letter? Clearly disguised my handwriting. The prosecutor won't know that I betrayed Dantes." "But is Dantes a traitor? A Bonapartiste?" said Caderousse. "Perhaps. We must say nothing," said Danglars. "If there is trouble, then it was Fernand who betrayed Dantes." Yes, you're right. We'll say nothing," said Caderousse, and he began to feel a little happier. Chapter 4. Villefort. In a large house in the centre of Marseille, another wedding feast was taking place. Some of the most important people in Marseille were guests at this celebration. They were talking about Napoleon. "Bonaparte will never rule France again," they said. "He's gone forever. He's exiled to the island of Elba. A king rules our country again." An old man stood up, lifted his glass of wine. "Let's drink to the health of King Louis," he said. The man was the Marquis de Saint-Méran, and he was a rich and powerful politician. Other guests lifted their glasses and repeated the old man's words. One of the men who drank to the health of the king was Gérard de Villefort. Villefort was a very happy man. This was his wedding feast. He was going to be married to Renée Saint-Méran, the daughter of the Marquis Saint-Méran. Although he was only 27, Villefort had an important position in the city. He was the prosecutor of Marseille. Villefort smiled happily. He knew that his career would improve after the marriage. An hour later, Villefort received a message and returned to his office. His friend, the shipowner Morel, was waiting outside the house. "Edmond Dantes, the first officer of my ship, has been arrested, said Morel. I know, said Villefort. I am going to speak to Dantès now. I was told that he had been brought here. Dantès is an honest man, said Morel. I am sure that he's innocent. He isn't a traitor. The charge must be wrong. Don't worry, said Villefort. I'll find out if he's a traitor or not. Villefort went into his house and gave an order to a police officer. A few minutes later, Villefort was sitting in his office. He was looking at the pale, calm face of a young suspect who was standing in front of him. Who and what are you? The prosecutor asked. My name is Edmond Dantès, replied the young man. I am the first officer of the Pharaon, which is owned by Monsieur Morel. And what is your age? 19. What were you doing when you were arrested? I was at my wedding feast, answered Dantès. I was going to be married. Villefort saw Dantès' happiness when he said this. He thought of his own wedding feast. He quickly continued with his questions. Were you ever a sailor in Napoleon's navy? Or are you a supporter of Napoleon now? Asked Villefort coldly. No, sir. Do you have strong political opinions? Asked Villefort. I don't have any political opinions, replied Dantès. I know nothing about politics. Do you have any enemies? Asked Villefort. Only powerful, important people have enemies, Dantès replied. And I'm not an important person. And what do the crew of the Pharaon think of you? Asked the prosecutor. The men who work with me love me like a brother, and they respect me. Is anyone jealous of you? Said Villefort. You're only 19, but you're going to be a captain soon. And you're going to marry a pretty girl who loves you. Perhaps someone is jealous of your good luck. Villefort took a letter from his pocket and gave it to Dantès. Do you recognize the writing on this letter? Dantès' face became pale. He began to be afraid. No, I don't recognize this writing, he said. The words look strange. Perhaps the writing is disguised. But the person who wrote this letter must hate me. Now, tell me the truth, said Villefort. Are you a traitor? Are you an agent for Bonaparte? Is anything in this letter correct? No. Yes, said Dantès. I'll tell you what happened. The Pharaon was taking a cargo from Smyrna to Marseille. We were going to stop at Trieste and Naples. When we left Naples, Captain Leclerc became ill. He had brain fever. He was very ill for several days. There was no doctor on the ship, and we could not help the captain. Before he died, Captain Leclerc called me to his cabin. My dear Dantès, he said, I have something to ask you. I want you to make me a promise. After my death, take the ship to the island of Elba. Go to the fortress on Elba and find Napoleon's advisor. His name is Marshal Bertrand. Give him this packet. Perhaps he'll give you a letter and some orders. Promise that you will do this. I made the promise, and the next day Captain Leclerc died. What did you do after he died? Asked Villefort. I sailed to Elba and went ashore alone, said Dantès. I gave the packet to Marshal Bertrand. He gave me a letter for someone in Paris. After my marriage, I was going to take it to Paris. Well, your story sounds true, said Villefort. And you were only following the orders of your captain. Give me the letter from Bertrand. You must promise to return here if I need to see you again. Am I free, sir? Yes, said Villefort. But first give me Bertrand's letter. You have it, sir, said Dantès. The police officer took it from me when I was arrested. He pointed at Villefort's desk. The letter is in that packet of documents. Dantes turned to leave the room. Villefort looked down at the packet on his desk. "Wait," he said. "What name was on the letter?" "Monsieur Noirtier, 13 Rue Coqueron, Paris," said Dantes. Villefort picked up the packet and opened it. There was now an expression of fear on his face. "Monsieur Noirtier, 13 Rue Coqueron," he said. His face had become very pale, and his hand shook as he picked up the letter. "Yes," said Dantes. "Do you know the gentleman?" "What? No," answered Villefort. "I'm not a friend of the king's enemy." Dantes now began to feel afraid again. "I don't know what is written in the letter," he said. "But you knew that it was addressed to Monsieur Noirtier," said Villefort. "Did you show this letter to anyone?" "No, sir," said Dantes. Villefort opened the letter and read it. Then he put his hands over his face. "What is the matter?" asked Dantes. Villefort looked at the letter again. Does Dantes know what is in this letter? He thought. Does he know that Noirtier is my father? And does he know that Noirtier is a supporter of Napoleon? If he does know this, then my career is ruined. Villefort tried to speak calmly. "Dantes," he said, "before I let you go, I must speak with someone. You must stay here a little longer. The only problem for you is this letter," and he stood up, went across to the fireplace, and threw the letter into the flames. "You see? It's gone." "Thank you, sir. You're very kind," said Dantes. "Say nothing about this to anyone," said Villefort. "If anyone asks you about the letter, you know nothing about it." Villefort opened the door and called a police officer. He spoke quietly to the officer. Then he turned to Dantes. "Follow this officer," he said. When they had gone, Villefort walked round the room. "Oh, Father," he cried, "your political opinions are going to harm my career and my happiness." Then he remembered the words in the letter. "But perhaps there is a way that your politics can help me," he said. He sat down at his desk and wrote a letter to the king's advisor in Paris. Chapter 5. The Chateau d'If. Dantes was taken from Villefort's office and locked in a small room. At 10 o'clock that evening, 4 soldiers came to the room. They took him outside to a carriage that was waiting in the street. Dantes looked at the soldiers. "Where are you taking me?" he asked. "You'll soon know," said the officer. "We can't tell you." Then a soldier pushed his gun against the young man's back, and they all got into the carriage. The carriage went quickly through the streets of the city and down to the harbour. A longboat with 4 sailors in it was waiting at the quay. The soldiers put Dantes into the boat, then they got into it too. The sailors picked up the oars and began to row the boat out of the harbour. "Where are you taking me?" asked Dantes. "Don't you know?" said the officer. "Turn round and look." Dantes turned. The boat had passed the entrance of the port. On the left he saw the dark shadow of the island of Ratonneau, and on the right he saw the black shape of the island of If. On the top of steep rocks was a great prison fortress, the Chateau d'If. The thick stone walls of the prison had stood for 300 years. Many stories were told about this terrible place. "The Chateau d'If!" cried Dantes. But Monsieur de Villefort promised. I don't know what Monsieur de Villefort promised, said the officer. We have to take you there. Those were our orders. No, stop! Dantes had stood up. He tried to jump out of the boat and into the sea, but two of the soldiers held him, and he fell back into the boat. The officer pointed his gun at Dantes. If you move again, I'll shoot you, he said. Half an hour later, the longboat reached the island of Ypres. The soldiers pulled Dantes out of the boat and held his arms behind his back. Then they pushed him up the wet stone steps and through the gate of the prison. Dantes looked around. He was in a courtyard which was surrounded by high walls. It was now completely dark. The only light came from a few lamps that were fixed to the walls. The soldiers and their prisoner waited in the courtyard for 10 minutes. Then a voice called, "Where is the prisoner?" "Here," replied the soldiers. "I'll take him to a cell," said the voice. It was one of the jailers. "Let him follow me." The soldiers pushed Dantes forward. "Go," they said. The young man followed the jailer to a small room which had stone walls and a thick wooden door. "You'll stay here tonight," the jailer said. "The governor is asleep. Perhaps he'll see you tomorrow. Here is bread, water, and a bed. You now have everything that a prisoner can want." Before Dantes could answer him, the jailer shut and locked the door and went away. Dantes stood alone in the darkness. For the rest of the night, he did not sleep. He walked round and round the cell. In the morning, the jailer returned. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "I want to see the governor," said Dantes. The jailer shook his head and left the cell. Dantes threw himself onto the floor and wept tears of anger. "What is my crime? I've done nothing wrong," he shouted. "Why am I in this terrible place?" At the same time the next morning, the jailer returned. "I want to see the governor," Dantes said again. "It's not allowed," the jailer told him. "What is allowed?" "If you have money, you can buy better food and books to read," said the jailer. "If you behave well, you can walk outside for a few minutes each day. Perhaps one day you might meet the governor." "How long will I have to wait before I see the governor?" asked Dantes. "A month, 6 months, a year," the jailer replied. "I can't wait that long," said Dantes. "I want to see him now." "If you wish for impossible things," said the jailer, "you'll go mad. There was a prisoner here who tried to buy his freedom. He told us that he would give us 1,000,000 francs. He was kept in this cell." "When did he leave it?" asked Dantes. 2 years ago." "Did the governor let him go free?" "No. The prisoner went mad. He was put in a dungeon." "If you help me, I'll give you 300 francs, said Dantes. "Please go to Marseille, find a young girl called Mercedes, and give her a letter from me." "I can't do that," said the jailer. "I would lose my job, and I don't want your money. I earn 2,000 francs a year." "Then one day I'll hit you when you enter this cell," said Dantes. "You are going mad," said the jailer. He went out and returned with 4 soldiers. "Take this prisoner to the dungeon," he said. "Put him in cell 34. This man is now prisoner number 34. Villefort was going to Paris to see the king's advisor. Before he left Marseille, a beautiful young girl stopped his carriage in the street. It was Mercedes. She spoke to Villefort through the carriage window. "Sir, where is Edmond Dantes?" she asked. "I can't tell you," said Villefort. "I don't know. I can do nothing for him. Now step away from my carriage." As Villefort travelled towards Paris, he thought about Dantes. He had sent an honest young man to the terrible Chateau d'If. He had ended the happiness of an innocent young man and his beautiful fiancée. Chapter 6. The King. Louis XVIII, the King of France, was in his favourite room in his palace. Louis was reading a book of poetry, and at the same time he was listening to some advice from a small 50-year-old man. "Majesty, I'm worried," said the man. His name was the Duc de Blacas, and he was the king's friend and advisor. "What are you worried about, Blacas?" asked the king, turning the pages of his book. "I believe that trouble is coming from the south of the country," said Blacas. "Will you send men into the provinces of Languedoc, Provence and Dauphiné? Send honest men that you can trust. Ask them to find out the feelings of the people in these southern provinces. Majesty, I'm afraid that Bonaparte or some of his supporters are planning to kill you." "Are you trying to frighten me, my friend?" said the king. "I've received a letter from a man in the south, Majesty," said Blacas. "I trust this man. The letter said that there is a plot against you. You are in great danger, Majesty." At that moment, d'André, the Minister of Police, entered the room. "Come in, d'André," cried the king. "Tell Blacas the latest news about Bonaparte. Blacas is trying to frighten me. He's talking about a plot by the Bonapartists." "Monsieur Blacas," d'André said to the Duke, "there is good news from Elba. My officers have reported that Bonaparte is very tired, and they say that very soon he will be mad." "Mad?" said Blacas. "Yes," answered d'André. "Sometimes Napoleon weeps, sometimes he laughs like a madman. 2 or 3 older members of his staff wanted to come back to France. Then Napoleon said, 'Go and serve the good king.' Those were his words." "Well, Blacas," said King Louis, "what do you think about this news?" "Perhaps I was wrong about Bonaparte's plans," said Blacas to the king. "But please speak to the person who sent me the information." "Oh, very well," said Louis. He put down his book and picked up a document from his desk. He turned towards the Minister of Police. "Now, d'André, do you have a new report from Elba? I've read this report, which has a date of 20th February. Today is 4th March. "Majesty, a new report will arrive very soon," said d'André. "Perhaps it's arrived since I left my office." "Then go and find out," said the king. "I'll wait here." "I'll return in 10 minutes, said d'André, and he left the room quickly. "I'll go and find my messenger, Majesty," said Blacas. "Who is your messenger?" asked the king. "Gerard de Villefort," said Blacas. "He's the prosecutor of Marseille." "Villefort?" cried the king. "Why didn't you tell me his name earlier?" "Majesty, I didn't think that you would know it," said Blacas. "But I do, Blacas," said the king. "I know all about Villefort. He's clever and ambitious. He'll be useful to us. And you know his father's name?" "His father, Majesty?" "Yes," replied Louis. "Villefort's father is called Noirtier." "Noirtier? The Bonapartiste?" said Blacas. He was surprised. "Majesty, do you wish to employ the son of a Bonapartiste?" Villefort wants to improve his career, said the king. He wants more power. He'll sell his own father to get that power. Where is Villefort now? He's outside the palace, said Blacas. He's waiting in my carriage. Bring him to me at once, said the king. Blacas returned with Villefort a few minutes later. Villefort, said the king, the Duc de Blacas tells me that you have some interesting information for me. Majesty, said Villefort, bowing towards King Louis, I have news of a plot against you. Bonaparte has left Elba and he's going to Italy. He's either going to the city of Naples or somewhere on the coast of Tuscany. I'm afraid that I do not know which place, but you know that he has friends in Italy and France. Yes, said Louis. Where did you get this information? I got it from a man in Marseille, replied Villefort. My men had been watching him for some time. I suspected that the man was a traitor. My men arrested him, and I questioned him. Then I immediately came to Paris. Who is this man? Asked Louis. And why do you suspect that he's a traitor? Majesty, the man is a sailor, replied Villefort. He went to the island of Elba and met Marshal Bertrand there. Bertrand gave the sailor a message for a Bonapartist in Paris. What is the name of this Bonapartist? Asked the king. The sailor wouldn't tell me the man's name, said Villefort. But the message told the people of Paris that Bonaparte was returning soon, and it promised that Bonaparte would rule France again. And where is this sailor now? He's in prison, Majesty. Do you think that this is a serious plot? Asked the king. I do, Majesty, said Villefort. I left my own wedding feast to come here and give you the news. Is it true that you're going to marry the daughter of the Marquis de Saint-Méran? Asked Louis. Yes, Majesty, said Villefort. Mademoiselle Renée de Saint-Méran is my fiancée. Very well, said Louis. Now don't worry about this plot, Villefort. My men have been watching the Mediterranean coast for 10 months. But thank you for coming to me. Ah, here is D'André, said Blacas. The Minister of Police had come into the room. He was holding a report in his hand, and he had a worried expression on his face. What's the matter, D'André? Asked the king. Majesty, began the minister. His voice was shaking. Well, said the king, tell me what has happened. I have a new report, said D'André. Napoleon left Elba on 26th February, and he came ashore on 1st March. Where did he come ashore? Asked the king quickly. Majesty, he came ashore near the town of Antibes, said D'André. He came ashore on 1st March? And you only heard the news today? Today is 4th March. The king was angry now. Majesty, it's true, said the Minister of Police unhappily. Napoleon is in France, said Louis, shaking his head. Majesty, said Villefort, the people of the southern provinces hate Napoleon. If he's there, it'll be easy to get the people of Languedoc and Provence to fight against him. Yes, that is true, said D'André. But Napoleon has quickly travelled north. He's moved through the towns of Gap and Sisteron in the eastern part of Dauphiné province. Is he coming to Paris? Asked the king. D'André did not answer. The king turned towards Villefort. What about the province of Dauphiné? He asked. Will the people of Dauphiné fight against Napoleon? Will they support me? No, Majesty, said Villefort sadly. They're Bonapartists. D'André, how many men are with Napoleon? Asked the king. I D'André! The king shouted. You have an office, a police department, and 1,500 francs to pay special agents. You have these things so that you can find out what is happening in France, but you don't know what is happening in one area, the southern coast. Then a prosecutor from a city in the south comes to me with information. He has learned more than you and all your police officers. D'André looked at Villefort with an expression of hate. I trust you, Blacas, said the king, turning to his advisor. You told me of your suspicions, and you brought Villefort to me when others might have sent him away. Majesty, we can be sure of your army, said Blacas. All your soldiers support you. All reports say... Reports? Said the king. How can we know that any reports are correct? But I remember something that may be important. You told me that General Quesnel died here in Paris, in the Rue Saint-Jacques. What have you found out about his death? The Rue Saint-Jacques? Cried Villefort suddenly. Oh, I'm sorry, Majesty, but... Go on, the king said to Villefort. Majesty, said D'André quickly, I have news about General Quesnel. He didn't kill himself. He was murdered. He disappeared one evening after he left a Bonapartist club. He was going to meet someone in the Rue Saint-Jacques. A stranger had called at his house that morning. One of Quesnel's servants heard the stranger say the name of the street, but not the number of the house, and we don't know the name of this stranger. When D'André told the king this, Villefort's face went pale. The king turned to him. Villefort, he said, Quesnel was not one of Napoleon's agents. He worked for me. He was loyal to me. He was trying to find information about Napoleon, but I believe that his murderer was one of Napoleon's supporters. Majesty, do we know any more about the stranger who went to Quesnel's house? Asked Villefort. D'André answered the question. Quesnel's servant said that the stranger was about 50 years old. The man had black hair and thick black side whiskers. He wore a blue coat and a hat with a broad brim. Yesterday, one of my agents followed a man who looked like this, but they lost the man between the Rue de la Jussienne and the Rue Coqueron. As he listened to D'André, Villefort felt ill. His legs became weak. He thought that he was going to fall to the ground. Continue to look for this man, D'André, ordered the king. Then he turned to Villefort. You must be tired after your journey, he said. Go and rest. Did you stop at your father's house before you came here? No, Majesty, replied Villefort. As soon as I arrived in Paris, I went to Monsieur de Blacas' house. Ah, I forgot, said the king. He smiled, but he also looked carefully at the prosecutor. You and your father are not good friends. He's a Bonapartist, and you are loyal to me. I thank you for your loyalty. Take this. Then Louis took a medal from his own coat and gave it to Villefort. Majesty, said Villefort, this is an officer's medal. Only army officers who have served bravely receive these medals. Take it, said Louis again. If you cannot serve me here in Paris, you may be able to serve me better in Marseille. Chapter 7. Monsieur Noirtier. Villefort returned to the hotel where he was staying. He called a servant and gave some orders. First, He asked for some breakfast. Then he asked for his carriage to be ready in 2 hours. He was eating his breakfast when the servant came into the room again. The servant told Villefort that someone had come to see him. "Who is it?" asked Villefort. "I don't know," replied the servant. "The gentleman won't tell me his name, but he wants to speak to you." "What does this person look like?" "He's about 50. He has black hair and black side whiskers. He's wearing a blue coat and a hat with a broad brim." "It's him," thought Villefort. At that moment, the man came into the room. "Father," said Villefort. He turned to the servant. "Go," he said. Noirtier waited until the servant was out of the room. Then he turned to his son. "Sirrah, you aren't very pleased to see me," he said. "Father," said Villefort, "I am pleased to see you, but I'm a little surprised. I came to Paris to save you." "You came to save me?" said Noirtier. "Tell me why." "Have you heard of the Bonapartist Club in the Rue Saint-Jacques?" asked Villefort. "Yes," replied Noirtier. "The club is in a house at number 53. "General Quesnel went there recently," said Villefort. "He left his house at 9 o'clock in the evening, and his body was found in the River Seine the next day. He had been murdered. You're in danger, Father. The king's agents are looking for supporters of Bonaparte." "And who told you this story?" asked Noirtier. "The king," replied Villefort. "Then I'll tell you another story," said Noirtier. "I think that I know it already," said Villefort. "Is it the news about Napoleon?" "I knew it before you did. 3 days ago, I knew that Bonaparte was returning to France. I left Marseille immediately and came to Paris." "How did you know about this 3 days ago?" said Noirtier. 3 days ago, Napoleon hadn't come ashore. "I read a letter that had come from Elba. It was addressed to you. I found it in the pocket of Bonaparte's messenger. If anyone else had found it, you would be dead now. You would have been executed." Noirtier laughed. "Executed? I don't believe that. Where is this letter now?" "I burnt it," said Villefort. "It was a dangerous letter." "It was dangerous for both of us," said Noirtier. "But I fear nothing while you are taking care of me." "I've done more than take care of you, Father," replied Villefort. "I've saved your life. General Quesnel was a special agent for the king. Quesnel's death was not an accident. He was murdered. The king himself said that the general was murdered." "The king?" said Noirtier. "Doesn't Louis know that there are no murders in politics? In politics, there are no men. There are only ideas. In politics, we don't kill a man. We remove something that is in our way. We thought that Quesnel was a loyal Bonapartist. We invited him to the club and told him our plans. When he'd heard and understood everything, he told us that he was loyal to the king. He promised to say nothing about what he had heard, but we didn't believe him. We let him go free, but he didn't return home. What does that mean? Quesnel had an accident, that's all." "Be careful, Father," said Villefort. "Napoleon's return is important for your plans, but Napoleon will not get far. He'll be followed and caught like a wild animal." "Oh no, my son," said Noirtier. "Napoleon is on his way to Grenoble at this moment. On 10th or 12th March he will be at Lyon, and on 20th or 25th March he will be here in Paris." "He has only a few men with him," said Villefort. "The army will stop him." "The army is loyal to Napoleon," said Noirtier. The army will bring him to Paris. The people of Grenoble will be happy to give their town to him. Everyone in Lyon will welcome our emperor. Gerard, I knew that you had arrived in Paris half an hour after you came into the city. You told nobody where you were staying, but I found you. The king's agents may be stupid, said Villefort, but they know what you look like. They know that a man with black hair, black whiskers, and a blue coat went to Quesnel's house, and they may catch the man with the blue coat soon. Then that man must make a few changes, said Noirtier. He pulled off his blue coat and went to a table in the corner of the room. He took his son's razor from the table and shaved off his whiskers. Then he cut his hair. He picked up his son's brown coat and put it on. Do you think that the police will recognize me now? No, father. Will you see the king again, Gerard? Asked Noirtier. Perhaps, said Villefort. Then give Louis this message. You're wrong about the people of France. Bonaparte is coming. He'll be welcomed. The people want Napoleon to be their emperor again. Go now and leave France to its real master. He will not hurt you. Tell King Louis this, Gerard, or tell him nothing. Tell no one why you've come to Paris. Return quickly to Marseille. Goodbye, my son. Noirtier left the room. Villefort went to the window and watched his father disappear round the corner of the street. Then he burned his father's coat and hat. An hour later, Villefort began his journey home to Marseille.
CD 2. The Treasure of Monte Cristo. Continued.
Chapter 8. The 100 Days. Noirtier's words were true. Napoleon returned to Paris on 20th March, and the people of France welcomed him. King Louis XVIII tried to stop this happening, but he had to leave his country. And so Napoleon became Emperor of France for 100 days. Although Villefort had been loyal to the king, Noirtier told Napoleon good things about his son. Villefort kept his position in Marseille, but he could not marry Renée de Saint-Méran. While Napoleon was emperor, Villefort needed Bonapartist friends to help him. The family of Saint-Méran were loyal supporters of Louis XVIII, but if Louis returned in the future, then Villefort would need Marquis de Saint-Méran again. If this happened, Villefort would marry Renée de Saint-Méran. The marriage would improve his career. One morning, Morel the shipowner came to see Villefort. "Sir," said Morel, "you remember that I visited you 6 weeks ago, before Emperor Napoleon returned to France. I spoke to you about a young man who was the first officer on my ship, the Pharaon. His name was Edmond Dantes. Dantes was arrested because he carried a letter from Napoleon on Elba. In February, that was a crime, but it would not be a crime today. At that time, you served the king and couldn't help Dantes. Today, you serve Napoleon. So I'm here to ask you this. What has happened to Edmond Dantes?" "Dantes," said Villefort slowly. "Edmond Dantes." He opened a large book and turned the pages. At last he looked up at Morel. "Are you sure that you have the right name, sir?" "Yes," said Morel. "I've known Dantes for 10 years. Don't you remember? I asked you to help him. You spoke to me coldly. You said, 'I'll find out if he is a traitor or not.' You were a loyal supporter of the king. You didn't want to help Bonapartists at that time. Sir, said Villefort, I did support King Louis then. I believed that the people wanted him to rule France. When Napoleon returned, I saw how his people loved him and hated Louis XVIII. I believe that the true king is the person who is loved by his people. That's right, said Morel. And so Edmond... Wait, said Villefort, turning the pages of his book. Here is his name, Dantes, a sailor who was going to marry a young Catalan girl. I remember now. Dantes was accused of treason, a serious crime. I made my report to Paris. He was taken away a week later. Where has he gone? Asked Morel. Oh, he was taken to Fenestrelle prison on the Sainte Marguerite Islands. He'll return one day. But why isn't he here now? Asked Morel. Napoleon's officials should let him go free. You must write to the Minister of Prisons, said Villefort. But the minister receives hundreds of letters every day, said Morel. He only answers 3 or 4. That is true, said Villefort. But he'll answer a letter that is signed by you and me. I'll deliver it. Villefort signed Morel's letter. Then he said, I'll send this for you. But Villefort did not send the letter to Paris. He kept it. He hoped that one day Louis would be king again. Twice during the 100 days, Morel came to ask about Dantes, and twice Villefort promised that he would help Dantes, and then he sent Morel away. On 18th June 1815, after 100 days had passed, Louis became king again. Morel did not visit Villefort again. Soon after Louis returned to France, Villefort married Renée Saint-Méran, and they went to live in Toulouse. 3 months after Edmond's arrest, old Louis Dantes became ill and died. Danglars went to Madrid. He did not want to be a sailor anymore. Fernand and Caderousse became soldiers in the army. Mercedes walked through the streets of Les Catalans and wept. She did not want to live without Dantes. She often stood and looked at the sea. Sometimes she thought about killing herself. She thought about jumping into the sea, but she did not. Edmond Dantes remained in his dungeon at the Château d'If. Chapter 9. The Tunnel. It was now 1816. A year had passed since Louis XVIII had returned to Paris. An inspector of prisons came to visit the Château d'If. He met the prison's governor, and then went to speak with several prisoners. Each prisoner said that the food was terrible, and that they wanted to be free. Prisoners always say the same things, the inspector told the governor. They all say, I'm innocent, I want to be free. Are there any other prisoners to visit? Only the dangerous and mad prisoners, replied the governor. They're in the dungeons. The governor, the inspector and 2 soldiers went down the dark stairs to the dungeons. The cells were cold, wet and dirty. They smelled terrible. The men stopped in front of a small wooden door with the number 34 written on it. Who's in here? Said the inspector, holding his hand over his nose. Prisoner number 34, a very dangerous man, said the governor. When he arrived, he tried to kill the jailer. That's true, said the jailer. He must be mad, said the inspector. He'll be mad in another year, said the jailer. He's almost mad now. There's another cell about 20 meters away, said the governor. The prisoner in that cell is a mad priest. He's been here since 1811. He went mad in 1813. I'll speak to both of them, said the inspector. Dantes was sitting on the floor in the corner of his cell. The only furniture was a small bed, a chair, and a wooden table. On the table there was a jug of water and a plate. The young man's face was very pale, and he had a thick black beard on his face. Dantes only saw daylight for a few hours each day. The light came through a very small window, which was high in one wall. He jumped up to meet the inspector, but the soldiers pushed him away. "What do you want?" the inspector asked Dantes. Dantes tried to speak calmly. "I don't want them to think that I'm mad or dangerous," he thought. "Sir, why am I here?" he asked. "What is my crime? I want a fair trial in court." "When were you arrested, prisoner number 34? asked the inspector. "The 28th February, 1815, at 2:30 in the afternoon," said Dantes. "Today is the 30th July, 1816, said the inspector. "You've only been here for 17 months. He turned towards the governor and said, "You must show me this prisoner's papers." "Sir," said Dantes, "I know that you can't free me, but please help me to get a fair trial. Please give me some hope." "I can't give you hope," said the inspector. "I can only find out about your arrest. Who arrested you?" "The prosecutor of Marseille, Monsieur Villefort." "Villefort left Marseille," said the inspector. "He now lives in Toulouse. Did he have any reason to be your enemy?" "No, he was very kind to me," said Dantes. "Then can I believe what he writes about you?" asked the inspector. "Yes, sir," said Dantes. Later, the inspector looked at Dantes' papers. He also read Villefort's report about prisoner number 34. Edmond Dantes, a dangerous Bonapartist, he helped Napoleon to return from the island of Elba. Put him in a cell alone. Watch him very carefully. After he had read this, the inspector wrote the words, "Do nothing." Weeks, months, and years passed. Dantes was now 25 years old. He was very thin and very dirty. His clothes were torn, and his hair and beard were long. He had hoped and prayed to be free, but this did not happen. One day he looked at his supper. There were a few pieces of bad meat and the small piece of dry bread on his plate. He was already extremely hungry, but he did not eat. "From today," he said, "I'll throw my food out of the window. If I don't eat, I'll die. Then my terrible life here will end." But one evening, Dantes heard a noise in the wall of his cell. Knock, knock, knock. He heard the knocking sound for nearly 3 hours. Then it stopped. What had made this sound? Several hours later, the knocking began again. It was nearer now. Suddenly, the jailer came into the cell and gave Dantes his breakfast. Dantes quickly began to talk. He spoke louder and louder. He was afraid that the jailer would hear the knocking in the wall. But after a minute, the jailer left. He thought that Dantes was mad. The noise continued, and it became louder. "It's another prisoner," thought Dantes. "Is he trying to make a tunnel so that he can escape? Or is someone working in the next cell?" He picked up his plate and knocked it against the wall. Immediately, the sound in the wall stopped. Dantes waited. If the knocking starts again, it will be a workman, he thought. But if a prisoner is making the noise, my knock will frighten him. He'll wait until everyone is asleep before he hits the wall of his cell again. There was silence. The noise did not begin again. 3 days later, Dantes heard sounds again. Was someone digging a tunnel? Had to help. Dantes looked at the stones in the wall of his cell. If he dug out the cement which was around the stones, he could remove them, but he needed tools. What could he use? Then he had an idea. He picked up his water jug from the table and dropped it on the stone floor. The jug broke into several pieces. Dantes took 2 or 3 of the sharpest pieces and hid them in his bed. When the jailer came again, Dantes spoke to him. "I dropped the water jug when I was drinking." The jailer was angry. "Be more careful," he said. He brought Dantes another jug, but he did not take away the broken pieces. After the jailer left, Dantes began to work on the wall. A broken piece of the jug was a good tool. He began to work on the wall behind his bed. Near the floor of the cell, the cement between the stones was old and soft. Dantes could dig out the cement easily. After many hours, Dantes had dug out the cement from a few of the smaller stones. These stones were now loose. Soon, he would be able to pull them out of the wall. Dantes worked for 3 days, but then he came to a very large stone that would not move. He could not move it with his fingers, and the sharp pieces of the jug had broken. He needed another tool. Dantes sat and thought. At last, he had an idea. The jailer always brought food in a metal pot and put some of it onto Dantes' plate. That evening, Dantes put his plate on the floor close to the door. When the jailer came into the cell, he stepped on the plate and broke it. Now Dantes could not have any food. "Please, will you leave the pot?" said Dantes. "You can take it away when you bring my breakfast." "All right," said the jailer. He did not want to come back with another plate. Dantes ate his food. Then he used the handle of the pot to dig out the cement around the large stone. After an hour, the stone came out of the wall. Now there was a large hole behind Dantes' bed. Hour after hour, Dantes continued his work. He was digging further into the thick wall. He was slowly making a tunnel. He worked until early the next morning. Before the jailer brought his breakfast, Dantes put the stone back into the wall and put his bed in front of it. "Did you bring me another plate?" Dantes asked the jailer. "No," the jailer replied. "You break everything. You can keep the pot. I'll put your food into it." Dantes said a prayer and thanked God for his good luck. Now he could use the handle of the pot to dig his tunnel. When the jailer had gone, Dantes began to work on his tunnel again. He worked all day. Soon the hole was big enough for a man to climb inside it. Dantes listened for sounds from the next cell, but there was silence. Perhaps the prisoner in the next cell did not trust him. After he ate his supper, Dantes worked for 2 or 3 hours. Suddenly, he came to a thick piece of wood. "Dear God!" cried Dantes. "Don't let me die here! Must I lose all hope?" "Who talks of God and losing hope at the same time?" said a voice. It seemed to come from under the ground. "An unhappy prisoner," replied Dantes. "What is your name?" said the voice. "Edmond Dantes." "How long have you been here, Edmond Dantes?" "Since the 28th February, 1815, said Dantes. "What was your crime?" "I did something which helped Napoleon to return to France," said Dantes. "I carried a message from him when he was exiled to the island of Elba in 1814. "He was exiled?" said the man's voice. "Yes," replied Dantes. "Didn't you know?" "I've been here since 1811, said the prisoner. Where have you been digging, Dantes? Where is your tunnel? It's near the floor of my cell, replied Dantes. How do you hide the hole in the wall of your cell? I put a large stone in the entrance of the hole. Then I put my bed in front of it, said Dantes. What's outside the door of your cell? Asked the prisoner. A passage which leads to a courtyard, Dantes said. Oh, cried the prisoner. What's wrong? Asked Dantes. I've dug my tunnel in the wrong direction, said the prisoner. I've made a mistake of nearly 5 meters. I thought that your wall was the outside wall of the prison. But then the end of your tunnel would have been above the sea, said Dantes. I was going to jump into the sea and swim to one of the islands near here, replied the prisoner. Can you swim as far as the islands? Asked Dantes. God will give me the strength, the prisoner replied. Who are you? Asked Dantes. I'm prisoner number 27, said the voice. How old are you? I was 19 when I was arrested. I'm almost 26 now. We'll talk again soon, said number 27. Wait until I call you. Dantes climbed back along his tunnel and into his cell. He was a happy man. He was not alone. He had a friend. Next morning, Dantes heard 3 knocks on the wall. He quickly moved his bed and went down onto his knees. He put his head down near the floor of the cell. Is that you, number 27? Dantes said. I'm here. Has your jailer brought your breakfast this morning? Asked the prisoner. Yes, said Dantes. He won't return until this evening. Then I can work, said number 27. After about an hour, part of the floor under Dantes fell away. He moved back quickly when small stones and earth disappeared into the hole. Then the head, shoulders, arms and body of a man appeared in the floor of Dantes' cell. Chapter 10. Faria. The man who climbed up into Dantes' cell was small and old. He had long grey hair, a thin face, and a long brown and grey beard. He thanked Dantes for his welcome. Then he looked at the hole behind Dantes' bed. You removed the stones, he said, but you didn't have the right tools to help you. No, said Dantes. He was surprised. What tools do you have? I took pieces of metal from my bed and made many tools, said the old man. I dug 15 or 16 meters to get here. I thought that I was going to the outside wall of the prison. I was going to jump into the sea. Who are you? Asked Dantes. What is your name? I'm a priest, said the old man. My name is Faria. I came to the Chateau d'If in 1811. Before that, I was in the fortress of Fenestrelle for 3 years. Why are you here, sir? In 1807, said Faria, I spoke against the governments who ruled the regions of Italy. I thought that one king should rule all of Italy. But powerful men heard about my political opinions, and I was put in prison. My plans failed, and now my tunnel hasn't been successful. Then Faria began to talk about some of the prisoners who had escaped from French prisons. Only a few prisoners escaped, he told Dantes. Some men planned for many months to escape. Others waited for a lucky chance, and then used it. Let's wait for our lucky chance, Dantes. Now, come and see my cell. Dantes followed Faria through the tunnel. In one corner of the priest's cell, there was an old fireplace. Faria lifted a stone which was in front of the fireplace. Some metal and wooden tools were hidden in this secret place. There were also several books. The pages of each book were covered with hundreds of lines of tiny words. I had 5,000 books in my library in Rome, Faria told Dantes. Now I spend many hours remembering those books, and I write about my thoughts and about my life. I write them in these books. The old man looked down at the tiny words in the pages of the small books. But how did you write down your thoughts? Asked Dantes. We're prisoners. We're not allowed to have pens, ink and paper. Sometimes they give us fish for our supper, said Faria. I keep the bones of the fish and I make pens from them. And I make paper from pieces of my shirts. I take black soot from the old fireplace and some wine that the jailer brings me. I mix them together and make ink. You're a very clever man, Faria, said Dantes. Now, please tell me your story, said the old man. Dantes told Faria everything that had happened on the ship Pharaon, and he told him about his wedding day. Only one man in the crew didn't like me, he said. His name was Danglars. He was the cargo master on the Pharaon. Was anyone with you during your last conversation with Captain Leclerc? Asked Faria. No, we were alone in the captain's cabin, said Dantes. But wait, I remember now. When Captain Leclerc gave me the packet for Marshal Bertrand, Danglars went past the cabin door. Did you take anybody with you to the island of Elba? Nobody, said Dantes. Bertrand took the packet and then he gave you a letter, said Faria. Is that right? Yes, said Dantes. I had the letter in my hand when I returned to the Pharaon. So Danglars probably saw the letter, said Faria. Yes, that's true, Dantes replied. You were arrested because of another letter, said Faria. Do you remember what it said? I remember every word, said Dantes. The prosecutor showed it to me. It said, this letter is from a friend of the king. Edmond Dantes, the first officer of the ship Pharaon, is going to deliver a letter to friends of Napoleon in Paris. You will find proof of this crime when you arrest Dantes, or proof can be found at his father's house. Describe Danglars' handwriting, said Faria. Danglars made strong marks and he wrote quickly. He used a lot of ink, said Dantes. But the handwriting in the letter from Elba was weak. The words were badly written. The writer of the letter disguised his writing, said Faria. And you think Danglars wrote the letter? Asked Dantes. Yes, I do, answered Faria. Did anyone want to stop your marriage to Mercedes? There was a young Catalan who loved her, replied Dantes. His name was Fernand. Did Danglars know Fernand? Yes, I saw them together at the cafe called La Réserve, said Dantes. They were in the cafe on the evening before my wedding. There was a third person with them, a man named Caderousse. And wait, I remember now. There was a pen and some paper on the table in the cafe. I was arrested because of a false letter. Did Caderousse, Danglars and Fernand know about it? I think that they did. But why was I sent to prison without a trial? That question is more difficult to answer, said Faria. He thought for a moment or two. Did you tell the prosecutor of Marseille your whole story? Yes, I did, said Dantes. He read the letter from Elba, and he was very upset about my bad luck. Your bad luck? Said Faria. Yes, replied Dantes. The prosecutor burned the letter. He said that he wanted to help me. The letter was the only proof against me. That is what he said. What name and address was on the letter? Monsieur Noirtier, 13 Rue Coqueron, Paris. Noirtier, said Faria. I knew a person with that name. What was the prosecutor's name? Villefort, said Dantes. Faria laughed loudly. Did Prosecutor Villefort tell you never to speak the name Noirtier again? Yes, he made me promise. That's because Noirtier was his father, said Faria. The prosecutor's real name was Noirtier de Villefort. Danglars, Caderousse, Fernand, and then Villefort. They all betrayed you. Dantes went back through the tunnel to his own cell. He sat and thought about his life. He did not want to kill himself now. He wanted to live. He wanted to escape and take revenge on his enemies. Faria promised that he would teach Dantes everything that he knew, and Dantes promised to help the old man to dig a new tunnel. 2 years passed. Dantes learned many things from Faria. The old priest taught the young man Spanish, English, German, and Italian. They talked about philosophy, science, mathematics, poetry, and politics. They also began to dig a new tunnel. But the work ended suddenly when Faria became ill. I know what is wrong, said Faria. I have brain fever. I've had the illness before. There's medicine in a small bottle under my bed. When I stop moving, and I'm cold like a dead man, open my mouth. Then you must pour 8 or 10 drops of the medicine into... The old man could not finish his sentence. His body began to shake. His face became red, and he cried out. He moved his arms and legs about wildly. Faria moved and cried out for 2 hours. Then he became still and cold. Dantes opened the old man's mouth and poured 10 drops of the medicine into it. Then he waited. The cell became dark. Night fell. At last, Faria sat up. He could not speak, but he pointed to the door and his plate. Dantes understood. He must leave Faria's cell immediately. The jailer was coming with their food. Dantes crawled back along the tunnel to his own cell. As soon as the jailer left the food, Dantes went back through the tunnel to Faria. The old man was able to speak now. I'll never leave Chateau d'If, Edmond, he said. I can't walk, and I won't be able to swim. We can wait until you're strong again, said Dantes. My dear friend, said Faria. You're young and strong. Don't wait for me. I won't leave you while you're alive, said Dantes. The next morning, Faria was a little better. When the priest saw Dantes, he gave him a piece of half-burned paper with writing on it. This paper tells where my treasure is hidden, he said. From this day, 1/2 of the treasure belongs to you. Your treasure? Said Dantes. Yes, I'll tell you about it, said the old man. I was once a secretary, and I lived in Rome. My employer was Cardinal Spada. He was a priest, and he was the last member of an old Roman family. The cardinal was not a rich man himself, but his family were once rich. In the 15th century, the Spadas had to hide their riches because of a cruel and ambitious man called Cesare Borgia. Borgia and his father, Pope Alexander VI, were the most powerful men in Rome, and they wanted to control all of Italy. Borgia murdered people so that he could take their money and property. Borgia knew that the Spada family were rich, so he invited the head of the family, Count Cesare Spada, to dinner. Count Spada knew that Borgia was going to kill him. A few months before, Borgia had murdered 2 cardinals so that he could have their money and property. Before Count Spada went to Borgia's house, said Faria, he wrote a letter to his nephew, Guido. The letter told Guido where the Spada's riches were hidden, but when he arrived at Borgia's palace, Count Spada saw his nephew talking with Borgia. Guido was also a guest at the dinner. Borgia gave Guido and Count Spada food and wine that contained poison. Both men died that evening. What happened to the letter and the money? Asked Dantes. No one ever found the letter or the Spada's riches, said Faria. Borgia took all of the family's papers and properties. He searched for many months, but he never found the letter and the treasure. Years passed, Faria went on. Some Spadas became soldiers, others became bankers or priests. Some Spadas had money, but most of them were poor. The last member of the family, Cardinal Spada, was my employer. He also looked for the Spada's treasure. He searched almost until the day that he died, but he never found it. When he died, all of his papers and some money came to me. On 25th December 1807, 2 weeks after the Cardinal's death, I was reading the papers for the 1000th time, said Faria. I fell asleep. When I woke, it was dark. I took a candle in one hand and found an old piece of paper. I wanted to light the candle, so I put the paper into the fire. I was going to carry a flame to the candle. Suddenly, I saw writing on the paper. The words were written in special ink, and the heat from the fire had made the words appear. I quickly pulled the paper out of the fire, but some of it was burned. It's the paper that you hold in your hand, Edmond. But half the words on each line are missing, said Dantes. Faria smiled. Then he gave Dantes another piece of paper with writing on it. These, I believe, are the missing words, he said. Put the 2 pieces together and read it. Dantes held the 2 pieces together and read these words. Today, Cesare Borgia invited me to dinner. I know that Borgia poisoned Cardinal Capra and Cardinal Bentivoglio and took their money and property. Now Borgia wants my property, money, and jewels too, but he will not get my treasure. I have hidden it in a secret place. After my death, I want my nephew, Guido Spada, to have all my money, gold, and jewels. The treasure is hidden on the island of Monte-Cristo. Guido knows the hiding place. Go ashore where there is a little creek. Walk east until you see a line of rocks. Lift the 20th rock and find the entrance of 2 caves. The treasure is in the corner of the 2nd cave. Count Cesare Spada, 25th April, 1498. A month after I found the old piece of paper, I was arrested, Faria said. Did you write the words on this 2nd piece of paper? Asked Dantes. I did, said Faria. I've thought and worked on these words for many years. If we escape together from here, half this treasure is yours. I give it to you. If I die here and you escape alone, all the treasure is yours. But the treasure belongs to you, said Dantes. I'm not a member of your family. I am a priest, said Faria. Priests cannot marry and have children. You are like a son to me now, Edmond. Chapter 11. Escape. Time passed. Faria did not know the island of Monte Cristo, but Dantes had often sailed past it. He told Faria about it. Monte Cristo was near an island called Pianosa, which was between Corsica and Elba. They talked about places where the treasure might be hidden. One night, Dantes woke up suddenly. Someone was calling him. He hurried through the tunnel to Faria's cell. The old man was sitting on the floor and holding the side of his bed. "My dear friend," he whispered to Dantes, "I am dying." "I saved you once," said Dantes. "I can save you again." "Well, you can try," said Faria. "But if I don't get better, pour all the medicine into my mouth this time." Dantes picked Faria up and put him on his bed. Then he went to the door of the cell to call for help. "No," said Faria. "If the jailer finds you here, you'll never leave the prison. Go back to your own cell. If you do escape, go to Monte Cristo. Find the treasure." Dantes held the old man's hand. "Goodbye, goodbye," said Faria. "Monte Cristo. Don't forget, Monte Cristo." The old man's head fell back and his mouth opened. Dantes quickly poured 10 drops of the medicine into Faria's mouth. He waited. 10 minutes passed. Then half an hour. Faria did not move. Dantes poured the rest of the medicine into Faria's mouth. The old man's body began to shake and he gave a short, sharp cry. He sat up in the bed and then fell back suddenly. He was dead. Dantes stayed with Faria until the morning. When he heard the jailer coming with the breakfasts, he returned to his own cell. First, the jailer came with Dantes' breakfast. Then he went to Faria's cell. Dantes listened at the entrance to his tunnel. He heard the jailer go into Faria's cell. Then he heard him call for help. He's found Faria's body, Dantes thought. Other men ran to Faria's cell. Then soldiers arrived. Finally, the governor came to the old man's cell. Dantes listened. "The priest is dead," said the governor. "Put him into a sack. We'll remove him this evening at 10 or 11 o'clock. Leave him now and lock his cell." Dantes heard the men leave. After a moment, he crawled through the tunnel to Faria's cell. He saw the sack with Faria's body in it. Then he went and sat on the bed next to his dear friend. "If I could die, I would be with my old friend again," he said. "But I will not die now. I want to live and find happiness again. Perhaps I'll find Mercedes. There are people who betrayed me, and I want revenge. But what shall I do? Dead people leave chateau d'If." As he said this, Dantes had an idea. First, he went to the fireplace and took Faria's tools and a knife from the hiding place. Next, he opened the sack and removed Faria's body. Then he took the body to his own cell and put it on his bed. He covered Faria's body with a blanket and turned his head towards the wall. "When the jailer brings my supper," Dantes thought, "he'll see Faria's body, but he won't see his face. He'll think that I'm sleeping on the bed." Dantes returned to Faria's cell quickly. He took Faria's needle and some thread. Then he got inside the sack and sewed it up from the inside. This was Dantes' plan. After the jailers had buried him, Dantes would wait. When the jailers had left the graveyard, he would cut open the sack. He would push up the soft earth and escape. He hoped that he was strong enough to dig through the earth quickly. If he could not get to the air, he would die. Dantes lay in the sack and waited. After many hours, he heard someone open the cell door. 2 men picked up the sack and carried him out of the cell. "He's a thin old man, but he's heavy," said one jailer. After a few minutes, Dantes felt the cold night air. They were outside the prison. The jailers put the sack down on the ground. "Where am I?" thought Dantes. "Is this the graveyard?" "Lift the lamp," said the first man. "I can't see clearly. I can't here it is." Dantes felt the jailers put something heavy next to the sack. Then they tied some rope around his feet. "Have you tied the rope tightly to the stone?" asked the second man. "Yes," replied the first man. Then they picked up the sack and walked about 50 meters. Dantes heard the sea crashing against rocks below the fortress. "The weather is bad," said the first man. "It's not a nice night for a swim." The second man laughed. "Ah, well, he won't be trying to swim," he said. 1, 2, 3! At that moment, Dantes felt himself flying through the air. Then he was falling. His body was pulled down by the heavy stone that was tied to his feet. Splash! He hit the ice-cold water. He gave a loud cry, and the water closed over his head. Dantes had been thrown into the sea. His grave was not in the earth. It was in the water. The sea was the graveyard of the Chateau d'If. Chapter 12. The Jeune Amélie. Dantes had to get up to the surface of the water. He must have air. He cut open the sack, but the heavy stone pulled him down deeper and deeper. Dantes pushed the knife down to his feet and cut the rope. Finally, the stone fell away and his feet were free. He kicked his legs. He must go up. He did not want to drown. He swam up until his head came out of the water. He took a big breath of air. Then he swam under the water again. He did not want the soldiers in the fortress to see him. When his head came out of the water for the second time, Dantes was 50 meters from the rocky shore. He listened. He did not hear shouts from the prison. No one had seen him escape. He began to swim away from the island. Soon he could no longer see the fortress. The sky became lighter. In a few hours the sun would rise. Rain began to fall, and a cold wind began to blow. Dantes swam for another hour. Suddenly the sky became darker. At the same moment he felt a sharp pain in his knee. He put his hand down and felt sharp rocks. He had reached the shore of an island. This must be Tiburon, thought Dantes. He knew that this small island was only a few kilometers from Chateau d'If. He pulled himself out of the water and walked a few meters onto the shore. Then he lay down and slept. After an hour, Dantes was woken by the sound of thunder. There was a terrible storm above him. Lightning flashed. The wind blew and rain fell heavily. Dantes opened his mouth and drank the rainwater. It was delicious. He turned towards the sea and looked at the sky and the waves. There was another flash of lightning, and Dantes saw a fishing boat. It was close to the island. Suddenly, a huge wave threw the boat against the rocks of the shore. There was a loud crash, and the wooden boat began to break. Dantes ran down to the rocks. The men in the boat fell into the sea. They saw Dantes and shouted, but he could not help them. All the men drowned. At last, the wind stopped blowing, and the sea became calm. When the sun rose, Dantes saw pieces of the fishing boat and a red fisherman's hat in the water. He looked towards Chateau d'If. In 2 or 3 hours, the jailer will find poor Faria's body in my cell, he thought. Then everyone in the fortress will begin to search for me. They'll search the sea around If, and they'll tell the police in Marseille about my escape. A few minutes later, Dantes saw the sails of a ship. He watched it come towards Tiboulon. Suddenly, Dantes had an idea. He jumped into the sea, lifted the red hat out of the water, and put it on his head. Then he held a large piece of wood that had come from the fishing boat. He began to swim towards the sailing ship. When he was near the ship, Dantes took off the red hat and lifted it up in the air. "Help! Help!" he shouted. The sailors on the ship saw the red hat in Dantes' hand, and they heard his shouts. 2 sailors got into a small boat, lowered it from the ship, and began to row towards him. Dantes began to swim towards the small boat, but he was very tired. He could not swim any further. His head went under the surface of the water. He was going to drown. Suddenly, he felt someone put their hands under his arms. A few seconds later, the sailors had pulled him up out of the sea. Dantes lay in the bottom of the boat. His head fell back, his eyes closed, and he heard nothing more. He had fainted. When he opened his eyes again, Dantes was aboard the ship. It was sailing away from the Chateau d'If. Someone poured some rum into his mouth, and the strong drink made him feel better. A dark, heavy man came to speak to Dantes. "You're on the ship Jeune Amélie," he said. "I am Captain Baldi. Who are you?" Dantes did not want to tell the captain his name, or where he had come from. I'm a sailor," he answered. He spoke in Italian. "My home is on Malta. I was on a ship that sank in a storm last night. I was lucky. I fell into the sea and held on to a piece of wood. The captain of my ship and the rest of the crew drowned. Thank you for saving me." "Look, what's happening at the Chateau d'If?" said one of the sailors. He was pointing to the north. Dantes looked up. He saw a small white cloud above the chateau. A few seconds later, he heard a loud explosion. "A prisoner has escaped from the Chateau d'If," said Dantes. "The soldiers are firing the fortress's cannon." The captain looked quickly at Dantes. Dantes was very thin, and his face was pale. His hair and his beard were long, and all his clothes were old and torn. "Perhaps this man escaped from the prison," thought Baldi. "I don't care. If he's a good sailor, he'll be useful to us." "Maltese," he said to Dantes. "Do you know the Mediterranean well? Do you know the best places to anchor a ship?" "Yes," Dantes replied. "I've been sailing on this sea since I was a young boy." The captain turned to one of the crew. "Jacopo," he said, "give this man a shirt and a pair of trousers." Jacopo went away and came back with one of his own shirts and a pair of trousers. He gave them to Dantes. "Thank you," said Dantes. "What is the date?" Jacopo was surprised. "Why do you ask me this? Have you forgotten?" I hurt my head when my ship sank," said Dantes. "I can't remember very much at all." "It's 28th February, 1829, said Jacopo. "Come with me, Maltese. I'll get you some food." 14 years had passed since Dantes had been arrested and taken to the Chateau d'If. He was now 33 years old. Chapter 13. The Treasure. The crew of the Jeune Amélie were smugglers. At first, Captain Baldi suspected that Dantes was a customs officer, but very soon Baldi was happy with the Maltese. Everyone on the Jeune Amélie liked Dantes, and Jacopo the Corsican became his good friend. The captain saw that Dantes was a good sailor. He found out that Dantes knew many small islands where the smugglers could hide their ship. After this, Baldi asked no more questions, and he paid Dantes well. For 2 months, the Jeune Amélie sailed along the coasts of the countries around the Mediterranean. At last, they reached Leghorn in Italy. Dantes went ashore to find a barber. He asked the man to cut his long hair and shave his beard. When the barber had removed all of Dantes' beard with a sharp razor, Dantes looked in a mirror. He was surprised when he saw his face. He was thin, and there were many more lines around his sad eyes. My family and friends won't recognize me, he thought. I don't recognize myself. Next, he bought new clothes, a pair of white trousers, a shirt with blue and white stripes, and a hat. A few days later, the Jeune Amélie left Leghorn and sailed south. The ship was carrying a cargo of cigars, sherry, and wine. The smugglers were going to take these things to a secret place on the coast of Corsica. Another ship was going to smuggle the cargo to France. The next morning, Captain Baldi saw Dantes standing on the deck of the Jeune Amélie. The ship was passing the small island of Monte-Cristo. Dantes was staring across the sea at the island. Every night, for 3 months, Dantes had dreamed about the treasure on Monte-Cristo. I could jump off the ship and swim to Monte-Cristo in half an hour, he thought. But what would the crew say? What would Captain Baldi think? The smugglers suspect that I have a secret. I don't want them to follow me. No, I must wait. I'll return to the island alone. Dantes had waited 14 years for his freedom, and now he was free. He could wait another 6 months or a year for his treasure. But was there really any treasure? Or was it only poor Faria's dream? Of course, there was Spada's letter. Dantes remembered every word of it. 2 months passed, and the Jeune Amélie returned to Leghorn. One evening, Captain Baldi took Dantes to an inn in the town. Dantes had visited the inn many years before. He knew that smugglers went there. Baldi thought that Dantes would soon leave the Jeune Amélie, but he wanted Dantes to stay and become a smuggler. He told Dantes his plan. The Jeune Amélie was going to meet a Turkish ship which carried a cargo of Turkish carpets and cloth from Kashmir. The two captains needed a secret place to meet. They were going to move the cargo from the Turkish ship to the Jeune Amélie. The smugglers did not want the customs officers to see this. "We'll use the island of Monte-Cristo," said Baldi to the Turkish captain. "No customs officer will find us there. Take your cargo to the island and we'll collect it later." Dantes was very excited. This was his lucky chance. Now he could get to the island and find Faria's treasure. Several days later, the Jeune Amélie reached Monte-Cristo. At 10 o'clock that night, the crew dropped the ship's anchor and the Jeune Amélie stopped near the shore. Dantes lowered a boat over the side of the ship and rowed towards the island. The Jeune Amélie's crew worked all through the night. They picked up the cargo which had been left by the Turkish smugglers. Then they loaded it onto the Jeune Amélie. In the morning, everyone rested on the soft sand of the shore, but Dantes did not rest. He told the smugglers that he was going to shoot one of the wild goats that lived on the island. "We'll have a good meal of goat meat when I return," he said. Then he took a gun and walked away from the shore. Jacopo called out, "I'll come with you!" Half an hour later, Dantes killed a small goat. "Take it back to the others," he told Jacopo. "They can cook it. When the meat is cooked, fire a gun and I'll return." Jacopo went back to the shore with the goat, and Dantes walked further across the island. He climbed up to the top of a high rock and looked down at the shore. The smugglers were busy by the fire. Dantes remembered Count Spada's letter and the words that Faria had written. "Go ashore where there is a little creek. Walk east until you see a line of rocks. Lift the 20th rock and find the entrance of 2 caves. The treasure is in the corner of the 2nd cave." Dantes began to walk across the island. After more than an hour, he found a path between 2 walls of rock. He went down the path and onto the shore. As he walked beside the sea, Dantes looked at the rocks above the shore. He began to count them. 1, 2, 3. Each rock had small marks on them. Had a man made these marks? But the 20th rock had no marks on it. "Perhaps I've made a mistake," Dantes thought. "There is no cave here, only a very large rock. Perhaps I'm going in the wrong direction. I'll go back and start again." He walked back past the rocks and along the path. When the smugglers saw Dantes, the captain called to him. "Maltese!" he shouted. "The meat is cooked!" The men watched Dantes coming down to the shore. They saw him jumping from rock to rock. Suddenly, his foot slipped on the edge of a rock, and he fell. The men ran to help him. When they reached Dantes, he was lying on the ground. They tried to lift him, but Dantes cried out. "Stop!" he shouted. "I've injured my back. I can't move. Leave me. Go and eat your meal. Let me rest." Later, the smugglers tried to move Dantes again. Once more he cried out. His face was pale. "Perhaps you've broken some of your ribs," said Baldi. "We'll stay here until this evening. We can try to move you then." "No, you must return to the Jeune Amélie," said Dantes. "You must sell the cargo. Continue your journey. Leave me some bread and rum, and leave me some gunpowder for my gun and a pickaxe. I'll get better soon, I'm sure. Make a small fire for me here. I can shoot a goat and cook the meat on the fire, and I can use the pickaxe to build a shelter." "Very well," said the captain. "We'll be away for a week. We'll come back for you in 7 days. Jacopo wanted to stay with Dantes. "You're a good friend to me, Jacopo," said Dantes. "But you must go with the others." "Very well, Maltese," said the Corsican. "Good luck!" An hour later, the Jeune Amélie sailed away from Monte-Cristo. When he could not see the ship's sails, Dantes stood up. There was nothing wrong with him. He had no injuries. He smiled, picked up the gun and the pickaxe, and ran towards the big rock. When he reached it, he walked all around it. "How did Spada lift this rock without any help?" he said to himself. "Of course, he didn't lift it. He pushed it down here." Dantes looked at the ground around the rock. Then he used his pickaxe to dig a small hole beside the rock. Next, he poured some gunpowder into the hole. He tore off a long piece of cloth from his shirt and put one end of it into the gunpowder. He made a flame and held it against the cloth. The piece of material began to burn. Dantes ran from the big rock and stood behind a smaller one. After a few seconds, the flame reached the gunpowder. It exploded with a loud bang. Dantes saw that the big rock had moved a few meters. It was now lying on some soft earth and small stones at the edge of a slope. Dantes pushed against the rock with all his strength. After a moment or two, the rock moved and began to roll down the slope. The rock rolled faster and faster until it fell into the sea. There was a flat, square stone where the rock had been lying. In the stone there was a large metal ring. Dantes pulled on the ring and slowly lifted up the stone. It was a door. Below the door there were some steps that went down under the ground. He had found the caves. Dantes went down the steps into the first cave. The air in the cave was cool and pleasant, and daylight came through a hole in the roof. He looked round the cave, but it was empty. Then he remembered the words in the letter. The treasure is in the corner of the second cave. Where was the second cave? He knocked on the walls of the cave with a pickaxe. In one place, the sound was different. Dantes hit the wall again, but this time he used the sharp end of the pickaxe. He hit the wall hard, and the rock fell away. Behind it, there were some square white stones. Dantes removed these quickly, and soon there was a big hole. When he climbed through the hole to the second cave, he saw that it was empty. Perhaps the treasure is buried in the corner under the floor, he thought. He walked across to the corner of the cave and began to dig. After a few minutes, he had removed many meters of earth and stones. Suddenly, his pickaxe hit something. He dug deeper. It was a wooden chest. Dantes dug the earth away until he could see all of the chest. On the top of it, there was a square of silver with a picture of a sword. Faria had told Dantes that this was the mark of the Spadas. Dantes opened the lid of the chest with a pickaxe. Inside, there was a wonderful treasure. Gold coins, silver, and very many jewels of all kinds. Dantes touched some of the coins and the jewels. Was he awake, or was it a dream? He laughed and danced round the cave. Then he fell onto his knees and thanked God. The next day, Dantes began to think more calmly. He filled his pockets with coins and jewels. Then he put the chest back into the hole in the floor. He covered the hole with some earth and stones and walked back through the caves. He shut the stone door at the top of the steps. Then he covered the door with earth and stones, and he planted some small bushes in the earth. Next, he took a branch from a tree and carefully removed all his footmarks. 6 days later, the Jeune Amélie returned to Monte Cristo. Jacopo and 3 other men rowed a longboat to the shore. Dantes told the smugglers that he felt much better. When the Jeune Amélie reached Leghorn, Dantes went to a jeweller's shop. He sold 4 of the smallest jewels from the treasure chest. The jeweller gave Dantes 20,000 francs for the jewels, and he asked no questions. The next day, Dantes bought a boat and went to speak to Jacopo. Dantes and Jacopo had become good friends. Dantes liked the Corsican, and he needed his help, but he did not tell the smuggler about the treasure. He gave the boat to Jacopo and asked him to sail it to Marseille. Then he gave Jacopo some gold coins. "Take this money to pay a crew," he said. Jacopo was very surprised. "My uncle has died and left me a lot of money," said Dantes. "I won't have to work as a sailor anymore." Then he told Jacopo that he knew how to get a lot more money. Jacopo was interested in this idea. He agreed to sail the boat to Marseille. "When you reach Marseille," said Dantes, "find out everything about an old man called Louis Dantes and a young woman called Mercedes." Dantes went to Captain Baldi and told him that he was leaving the Jeune Amélie. He gave presents to the captain and the crew and said goodbye. Then he went to buy a yacht. This little boat was small and fast, and Dantes could sail it alone. Dantes sailed first to Genoa and then to the island of Monte Cristo. When he reached Monte Cristo, Dantes went ashore and walked all around the island. There was no one there. He was alone. That night, he slept for only a few hours. He was very excited. At sunrise, Dantes began to remove the treasure. He worked all through the day. By the evening, all the treasure was hidden in his yacht. For 7 days, Dantes watched the sea. He sailed slowly around the island. On the 8th day, he saw the sails of Jacopo's boat. Soon, he was anchored beside it. Jacopo told him the sad news that he had heard in Marseille. Old Louis Dantes was dead, and Mercedes had disappeared. On a fine day, a few weeks later, Dantes arrived in the port of Marseille. I can't use the name Edmond Dantes anymore, he thought. People will be looking for Edmond Dantes, the prisoner who escaped from Chateau d'If. I want to stay a free man. A lucky chance and dear Faria have made me a rich man. Perhaps I can start a new life with a new name. I shall become the Count of Monte Cristo. He smiled. I like it, he said. Now it was time to find his enemies and take revenge.
The Treasure of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. Retold by John Escott. Published by Macmillan Heinemann ELT, a division of Macmillan Publishers Limited. Copyright Macmillan Publishers Limited, 2007.
Произведение «Граф Монте-Кристо» состоит из 2 томов. Сейчас мы с вами слышали только первую книгу. Вторая книга «Реванш», после того, как он вернулся в мир под новым именем Граф Монте-Кристо, стал свободным человеком, она недоступна. У меня ее нет на английском языке. Прочитайте это произведение. Александр Дюма, «Граф Монте-Кристо». Классная вещь во всех отношениях. На всю жизнь останется впечатление. А мы с вами приехали к границе государства российского, западная граница, погранпереход Нехотеевка. Заканчиваем нашу видеозапись. До цели 304 километра, весь день впереди. Удачи вам, до свидания. Граница.